She was born beneath the glow of a blood moon. The bells of the cathedral rang through the winter fog, echoing over frozen rooftops and muddy streets slick with the footprints of desperate men. Inside the palace, torches flickered in damp hallways, casting long shadows on stone walls too old to remember kindness. And in a chamber hung with silks and saints, a baby girl drew her first breath. The midwives whispered it was an omen, the moon, the frost, the cries of peasants rising from the city below. But none dared speak it aloud. Not here, not while the queen, pale and shivering, reached out to touch the swaddled child who would bear her hopes, her fears, and her fate. The king stood apart, already calculating, already disappointed. A daughter, not. A soldier, not an heir. Just another fragile limb on a family tree already splintering under its own weight. Still, a feast was called. Trumpets announced her birth to the court. Scrolls were sent to neighboring realms with trembling wax seals that promised unity and future alliances. They called her blessed, chosen, a light in dark times, and they named her after a saint who had died young. From the very beginning, she was both adored and dismissed, cradled in lace, yet considered collateral. In public, the queen smiled as she carried the infant through the chapel, the scent of incense clinging to their skin. In private, she wept into her daughter's cradle, whispering prayers to keep the girl safe from the court, from the church, and from her own bloodline. The child was beautiful, of course, golden hair like candlelight, eyes too old for her face. Courtiers came to stare. One touched the baby's hand and recoiled, swearing she looked straight through him. Another swore she smiled when a bishop's blessing fell upon her forehead. The nannies whispered that she never cried. Not once, not even when left alone in her velvet-trapped cradle at night, surrounded by portraits of dead ancestors and the cold hush of old stone. Beyond the palace walls, death had come again. The pox was spreading. A famine threatened the countryside. Her birth brought no relief, only spectacle. While the kingdom rotted from its edges, the palace performed its rituals. A silver cradle was hammered into shape by blind artisans, its surface etched with symbols no one could translate. A nursemaid died the night before the naming ceremony. They buried her quickly, quietly as the child grew. So did the weight of the silence around her. She was not yet a girl, and already a ghost in her own home, seen but not spoken to, present but never heard. Her every breath measured, every step rehearsed. She was dressed like a queen before she could walk, bound in corsets before she could speak. A life wrapped in velvet, sealed in expectation. Behind her, the walls whispered. A servant claimed he saw the girl staring at her own reflection in the polished floor, murmuring words in a language he didn't recognize. Another said he found feathers beneath her crib, though no birds were allowed in the nursery. The queen dismissed the stories. The king never listened, but the stories grew dot, so did the shadows, and in the quiet, hours between candlelight and morning, when the palace creaked and the frost clawed at the windows, the child would lie awake, still, silent, eyes open, watching the ceiling, as if waiting for something to fall. No one saw the trap being laid, not yet, but already the air around her was thick with prophecy and fear. She was a daughter, a prize, a mistake, a future no one could control. And somewhere deep beneath the palace, past the chapel, past the wine cellars, past the walls even the king had forgotten, a room waited. It would be many years before the girl reached it, but her story had already begun walking toward it quietly, Inevitably, by the age of 7, she had learned how to bow without trembling. The court watched her every move with breathless precision, as if waiting for a miracle or a scandal. She no longer ran. Children run, queens glide. And though she was neither, yet she already knew that the difference could mean survival. Each morning began with layers, not just of clothing, but of expectation. Woolen underskirts, boned bodices, jewels that pinched her collarbones, laced so stiff it scratched her chin raw. Once dressed, she was no longer a child. She was a spectacle painted in ivory powder, lips stained with crushed berries, eyes outlined in the color of bruises. "She's becoming a proper little lady," they said, smiling at the illusion they had built. But the girl said nothing. She had learned early that silence was rewarded. A smile earned her longer walks in the garden. A perfect curtsy earned her praise in front of the bishop. Crying earned her nothing, not even attention. Lessons began before the sun rose. Latin verbs, ancestral history, posture drills, religious dogma. She memorized the sins she had not yet had time to commit. She copied out passages on the obedience of wives, the patience of saints, the dangers of vanity. She could recite 30 psalms before she had her first loose tooth, and still, they asked more of her. She was expected to speak when spoken to, but not too boldly, to walk like a queen, but never ahead of her elders, to smile sweetly at diplomats from kingdoms she could barely locate on her maps, to dance with shoes that blistered her heels until they bled. Once, a visiting noble from the East gave her a porcelain doll dressed like a bride. The child studied it for a long time, turning it over in her hands. Then she asked, in a voice too quiet to challenge but too sharp to ignore, "Is this what I will look like when I'm sold?" The queen turned pale. The doll was taken away. No one spoke of it again, but the servants did whisper. They said the girl had spirit, that dangerous, uncontrollable thing, a glint behind the eyes, a silence too deep to be passive. One nursemaid claimed the girl was overheard whispering to herself in the long hours of twilight, answering her own questions as if something was listening. Another insisted the child never blinked during prayers. Still, the displays continued. She was paraded like a trophy during court dinners, made to perform hymns and foreign greetings, praised for her elegance. Foreign ambassadors took note of her height, her composure, her silence. She was a marvel, they wrote, with the calmness of marble and the precision of a clock. No one mentioned her nightmares. She had started waking in the middle of the night, unable to breathe. Dreams of red water, of walls that moved, of mouths whispering in a language she didn't know but somehow understood. The priest told her it was just the devil testing her. The queen told her to pray harder. The tutor said nothing and simply turned the page to the next lesson. One day, while dressing for a portrait, the girl asked a question that stopped the room cold. "If I'm not allowed to be a person, what am I?" No one answered. The painter smiled nervously and asked her to tilt her chin. The portrait that resulted would hang in the great hall for centuries, her small frame buried in brocade, her hands crossed just so, her face blank and perfect, a masterpiece of erasure, a monument to expectation. No one remembered what she had said that day, but they remembered the painting. By 8, she had forgotten how to cry. By 9, she had stopped laughing. By 10, she had learned how to disappear in plain sight. She could fold herself inside gowns, inside roles, inside silence. They called her well-raised, dignified. a perfect little lady, but behind her eyes something had shifted, not broken, just bent enough to hold weight no child should carry. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the palace settled and the candles sputtered out, she would lie in bed and stare at the canopy above her, not imagining a future, not remembering a past, simply bracing, because by now she understood this life wasn't something she was living, it was something she was surviving. And in the distance, beyond the lessons and dances and curtsies, the cold breath of something darker was stirring, waiting for the moment when the doll in the dress would either shatter or vanish. The king died on a Tuesday, not in battle, not in ceremony, not in the pages of a heroic legend, but in his chamber, slumped in a velvet chair, his wine untouched and his eyes staring at something no one else could see. The physicians, lead, of course, called it fever, called it divine calling, called it anything but what it was, a sudden death with no warning and no clear air. The kingdom went quiet, not the respectful quiet of mourning, but the uneasy hush of a room where no one knows who is in charge. In the corridors of power, chaos bloomed behind closed doors. The nobles whispered, the bishops panicked. The queen, suddenly draped in black and surrounded by incense and whispers, did not cry. She hadn't cried in years. Instead, she sent for the council. The problem was simple and terrifying. There were no sons. There had been, once, a sickly boy who died before his 3rd birthday, a bastard half-brother locked in a distant monastery, a cousin too unstable to speak his own name. The bloodline had grown thin, tangled, and poisoned by ambition. And now, with the king's body cooling in the cathedral, the kingdom faced a question it had hoped never to ask. What if the crown must fall on the head of a girl? The council met under torchlight, voices low, hands shaking. Some argued for war, others for regency, some for inviting foreign rule, but no option came without blood. And then the queen spoke. She is young, she said, but she is royal. She is prepared, prepared. The child had been groomed for marriage, not power, taught to recite, not to rule. But the queen's voice was iron, and so they nodded, slowly, uneasily, as men do when they are conceding not to agreement, but to fear, and so it was decided. The proclamation was written at dawn. The scribes' hands trembled as they wrote her name in gold ink. No one cheered when it was read aloud in the square. No bells rang. The people watched from windows and behind shutters, uncertain if they were witnessing salvation or surrender. The girl, barely 10 years old, was brought to the chapel in silence. They didn't dress her in royal red. Instead, she wore white, too pale against her skin, too stiff to move in. Her crown had to be resized twice, once when it slipped off her head, and again when it dug into her scalp. They called it a coronation, but it felt more like a ritual. She stood before the altar, flanked by priests and generals who had once ignored her. Now they knelt, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Every oath they swore was tinged with calculation, and she said nothing. When they placed the crown upon her head, she did not flinch. When the holy oil touched her forehead, she did not close her eyes. She stood like a statue, perfect, still, unreadable. A queen carved from silence. Those watching saw strength, composure, grace. What they didn't see were her hands, clenched so tightly beneath her sleeves that her nails cut crescent moons into her palms. After the ceremony, the palace was quiet. Again, no feast was held. The The king's body still lay in state. The queen retired to her chambers and locked the doors. The child queen was escorted to her new quarters, larger, colder, Lonelier. She sat on a throne too big for her frame, her legs dangling just above the marble floor. And in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just a crown, it was a verdict. She had not been chosen. She had been cornered, and though she did not know it yet, the crown on her head would not protect her from the wolves. It would only make the blood easier to see. Outside, the people lit candles and prayed. Inside, the court sharpened its knives, and at the center of it all, the girl sat still, small, silent, heavy with gold, too young to rule, too dangerous to remove, a queen in name, a warning in flesh. The walls had ears. That much was certain. It began with whispers, nothing formal, no declaration, just a phrase here, a knowing glance there. She's ... not quite right. A strange girl, that one. Did you hear what she said to the bishop? What had been curiosity became caution. What had been caution soon curdled into fear. They stopped calling her Your Majesty when they thought she couldn't hear. To her face, they smiled. Behind her back, they lowered their voices. She didn't help. Her own cause, of course, not by court standards. She asked too many questions, and the wrong kind. Why had she never seen the West Wing? Why did no one speak of her father anymore? Why were there so many locked doors in her own home? A queen, even a child queen, was not supposed to ask. Worse still, she didn't blink when she should have. She stared at things, flames, shadows, too long, too directly. One maid claimed the girl spent an entire night standing by a stained glass window, watching the moon pass behind the cathedral spire. When asked what she was doing, the girl answered calmly, listening. To what, she never said. A priest summoned from the capital to observe her spiritual development reported troubling signs. She does not respond to sacred music, he wrote. She recites her prayers perfectly, but without conviction. Her voice is too steady. Her eyes are too clear. It is unnatural, unnatural. That was the word that sealed her fate. From there, the rumors deepened. One claimed she had visions. Another said she could read Latin texts she had never been taught. A visiting noble swore the girl corrected him mid-conversation. In a dialect not spoken for 2 generations, her tutors were rotated, one after another, each left with increasingly vague reasons. She unnerves me, one finally admitted, refusing to return after she asked him whether a soul could be born with a memory older than its body. She was not mad, at least, not in the way they meant, but madness is often decided not by doctors, but by consensus, and in a court of whispers, perception became reality. She began to notice changes. Subtle at first, one of her ladies-in-waiting, her favorite, was sent away without explanation. A mirror disappeared from her chamber. Her books began to arrive with whole pages blacked out. The palace felt colder even in summer. Doors creaked open on their own. Or perhaps someone left them that way. Someone always watching, testing, waiting. For her to slip at dinner, she was never seated at the head of the table. A temporary tradition, they said. At court assemblies, they presented decisions already made in her name. Sign here, they said. Smile there. Her power was performative, her voice ornamental. Yet the more they tried to reduce her to silence, the more she remembered who she was supposed to be. She began to write letters, dozens of them, notes to lords she trusted, messages to foreign courts, even letters addressed to herself. Most never reached their destination. Some were never returned. One night, she caught a servant reading her journal. He did not apologize. The next morning, it was gone. When she asked the Queen about it, her mother only stared out the window and said, "It's safer this way." But safe for whom? Soon after, the cardinal arrived, not with scripture, but with an exorcist. They claimed it was a ritual blessing for her spiritual protection. In truth, it was an interrogation in robes. They asked her to renounce her doubts, to swear fealty not just to the church, but to silence. She did neither. After that, her food began to taste different, and people began to disappear. The chambermaid vanished after reporting strange laughter from the girls' rooms. A page was found dead in the garden well. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, no one asked questions anymore. Even the walls grew heavy with tension. She began to hear echoes in places that shouldn't: echo stone corridors, curtained halls. Her own voice returned to her, warped, as if the palace itself had begun to mimic her. One night, she whispered a prayer and heard it repeated, softly. From somewhere behind the hearth, she tore the wall open with her bare hands. Behind it, nothing, just dust and a ring. Her father's ring. The next day, she was told she must take a retreat for her health. The Queen kissed her forehead, the first affection in years. "They're afraid of you," she said, her voice flat. "That means you're doing something right." But the girl didn't feel triumphant. She felt cold, like the palace had passed a sentence she couldn't read. Written in stone, echoed in whispers, hidden in walls that knew too much. And somewhere deep inside them, a door was about to close. The carriage climbed the winding road in silence. No guards, no fanfare, just a cloaked girl, a wooden box of belongings, and a journey that would end in stone and stillness. She had not been told where she was going, only that it was for her peace, for her purity, for the good of her soul and of the crown. It was not exile. Not formally, it was something colder. The convent loomed on a cliffside, wrapped in mist and shadow. Its bell tower pierced the sky like a dagger. The gates opened with a moan. Nuns in grey habits appeared from the fog like ghosts. None smiled. "This is the house of the veiled light," the abbess said, and the girl was led inside. The rules were simple and brutal. No mirrors, no letters, no questions. Speak only when addressed. Sleep clothed. Pray hourly. Confess everything. The abbess took her crown and locked it in a reliquary. "You are not here to rule," she said. "You are here to be emptied." The halls were long and windowless. Candles cast long, shivering shadows. The silence was not peaceful, it was enforced. The nuns moved like spectres, their faces hollow from years of submission. They never looked her in the eye. She was given a cell, one straw bed, one basin, one crucifix. Her meals were bread, broth, and whispers. She was not punished with whips. That would have been too obvious. She was punished with absence. Her name was never spoken. Her questions never answered. Her requests never acknowledged. One day, she asked for ink and parchment. She received a rosary. Another day, she asked if the Queen would visit. The abbess smiled. "You are dead to the court, child, but in death we find grace." She began to unravel, not violently, but invisibly. Her silence deepened. Her skin paled. She walked barefoot through the chapel at night, touching the cold stone and whispering names only she remembered. Her prayers became poems strange, beautiful, unholy things that frightened even the elder sisters. She scratched verses into the underside of her bed, into the corners of her walls, into her skin. They took away her blankets. They said suffering would make her holy. She began to forget the sound of her own voice. This was not just retreat. It was erasure. In the theology of the time, holiness in women was measured in obedience, in silence, in stillness. A good woman was a sealed vessel. A perfect woman was invisible. And a holy queen, especially one who frightened the court, had to be both. The abbess praised her progress, said the girl was finally surrendering to grace. But in her heart, something else was blooming, not rebellion. Not yet, something quieter. A realization they were not trying to change her. They were trying to dissolve her. And if she let them, they would. So she stopped eating, not to die, but to control. They could force silence, but not hunger. They could bind her body, but not her will. When they asked if she was unwell, she smiled. When they warned of penance, she nodded. When they begged her to confess, she said nothing at all. One night, she was found kneeling in the crypt, surrounded by extinguished candles, staring at the bones of a saint. The abbess slapped her. She did not flinch. "You are not holy," the woman hissed. "You are hollow." The girl finally spoke, "And yet still, you fear what's inside me." It was the last time anyone touched her. After that, her isolation deepened. Her cell door was barred from the outside. Meals were passed through a slot. Her voice faded again. Her body thinned. Her hair grew long and wild. She was no longer treated as royalty, nor as a sinner, but as something else entirely, something neither human nor divine, something that could not be controlled, only contained. The convent had become a cage, but it would not be the last. Far beneath the altar, past the chapel and catacombs, there was another door, one that had not been opened in generations, not for the unworthy, not for the weak, only for those deemed dangerous enough to disappear completely. They called it a consecration, a sacred binding of soul to heaven. But what unfolded beneath the chapel was not holy. It was ritualized annihilation. It began at dusk, when the bell tolled once, long, low, and final. She was taken from her cell, washed in cold water, and dressed in white. Not the embroidered silk of her coronation, but rough linen, plain and unmarked. Her hair was combed straight, then veiled. Her feet were bare. The abbess told her she was to be wed. To whom? She asked. To God came the answer, but even the nuns didn't sound convinced. The procession wound down into the catacombs beneath the convent. Candles lined the walls. The air was heavy with myrrh and dust. Monks waited in silence, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their hands clutching open books, not Bibles, but liturgical scripts written in Latin, so old even the priests had to guess at its meaning. At the center of the crypt was a stone slab draped in black. She was led forward, barefoot, her veil trailing like smoke behind her. "Kneel," they said. She did. They circled her. Incantations began, murmured, rhythmic, void of joy. This was no wedding. This was a funeral dressed in the language of piety. She was not becoming a bride. She was becoming a ghost. Her vows were not spoken. They were recited over her. Promises. She did not make oaths. She did not understand. The abbess approached with a candle and held it before her face. "You were born a daughter of men," she intoned. "Now you are no longer." With that, the monks began to chant the burial rite, not metaphorically, literally. They chanted as if she were dead. They anointed her forehead with oil. They drew a cross on her chest. They sprinkled ash on her shoulders. Then they placed a thin white cloth, a burial shroud, across her back. And all the while she remained kneeling, not out of obedience, but because to stand would have meant interrupting a machinery far more ancient, far more dangerous than her. When it ended, no one helped her rise. She stood alone. Her legs trembled. Her veil slipped. No one moved to fix it. The abbess turned and nodded to the monks. One produced a scroll from his robe, a decree signed by the queen herself. It bore a single sentence: "Let it be known that she is no longer of the world." The girl's name, her royal name, was then scratched out from the convent registry, blotted in black ink so thick it bled through the page. A second registry, the one kept for state records, was altered the same way. In the eyes of both, church and crown, she no longer existed. No one clapped. No bells rang. No feast was held. The procession did not return to the chapel. Instead, she was led down a corridor so narrow she had to turn sideways to pass. A staircase twisted downward, deeper than the catacombs, into air so stale it clung to the skin. There, behind an iron gate, was her new cell, smaller than the last dot. No window, no candle, only stone, and the faint scent of mold and salt. "This is your sanctum," the abbess said. "Speak no more of what you were. God hears only what you become." And then the door closed. There was no lock, just a weight of wood and silence. She sat in the dark, the burial cloth still on her shoulders, and realized they had not killed her. They had simply erased her. No grave would bear her name. No records would list her reign. Her portrait had been removed from the palace, her belongings sold or burned. Her mother never spoke of her again. Even the crown, the one once forged for her head, was quietly melted and reforged into chalices. For church ritual, all symbols consumed, all traces rewritten. Only one thing remained, her memory, and that they could not reach. In the dark, she whispered her name again and again, softly, fiercely, as if holding it in her mouth could keep it from vanishing. Because now she knew the truth. This was not a death. It was something worse. It was survival. No one would acknowledge. There was no clock in the cell, no candle to mark the hours. Time thickened, then dissolved. At first, she counted the days by the scrape of the food tray. A thin metal plate slid through a gap so small she could barely see the hand on the other side. A watery broth, a crust of bread, sometimes an apple, browning and soft. But even that rhythm began to betray her. Meals came later, or earlier, or not at all. There were no explanations, just silence, punctuated by the distant, muffled tolling of church bells above, the only reminder that a world still moved without her. Soon she lost her count. She tried to remember prayers, royal names, faces from the court, but each time she reached for a memory, it returned faded, like fabric bleached in sun. First the faces went, then the places, then her own voice. She hadn't spoken aloud in weeks, maybe longer. The walls were cold stone, always damp. The ceiling dripped in winter. In summer, it baked the air into something suffocating. Her bed was a slab of wood. Her blanket a tattered wool sheet, chewed at the edges by something she never saw. There was a latrine in the corner, a hole with no cover, no dignity. When she cried, her tears left trails in the dust before drying. Invisibly. No one spoke. to her, not the nuns, not the abbess, not the monk who left her food. No one said her name. And then, one day, even the slot was gone. She woke to the sound of bricks, muffled, deliberate. Someone was sealing the opening, layer by layer, stone by stone. At first, she thought it a hallucination, a trick of her mind, so starved for sound it invented terror to keep itself company. But no, it was real. The next morning, there was no food, no light, no voice, only the echo of her own breath bouncing off what had once been air. They were sealing her in, not killing her, just separating her further, so far that she could no longer see the outline of a door, no longer sense the difference between wall and exit. There was no protest. What would be the point? She was already half gone. Her fingernails grew long, her hair tangled into ropes, her skin peeled from dampness. Her voice, once delicate and high, had vanished into a rasp. Sometimes she'd hum just to hear something, just to remind herself that she still existed. Other times, she pressed her ear against the stone and tried to catch a sound from the world beyond. A hymn, a footstep, a cough. Anything done, nothing came. The stone did not echo. It absorbed, and so did she. She stopped standing. Her limbs ached with cold. Her joints stiffened. Her hunger dulled to a vague, persistent ache. Some mornings, she awoke and could not remember who she was mourning. Was it herself or someone else? She began to forget her own name, not just the title. The name, she tried to repeat it every night, like a spell. But there were days, long stretches, where it wouldn't come, where all she could recall was a melody, or a color, or a flash of sunlight on stone. That was all that remained of her past. Fragments, a feeling, an echo, a ghost with no story. One night or day, time was meaningless. She pressed her hand against the stone and whispered, "I am not gone." It came out cracked, like broken glass, but it was the truest thing she had spoken in years. Because she wasn't gone, she was still here, trapped in stone, caged by silence, but here, and that was what they feared. She realized that, finally, the bricks, the locked doors, the sealed records, they weren't about death, they were about control. She was buried, not because she had died, but because she had once mattered, because for a moment in time, she had been the axis of power, a girl with a crown balanced on a trembling head, and they could not risk that. Memory living on, so they bricked it in, out of sight, out of history, out of mind. But memory is not so easily extinguished. It leaks, it whispers, it finds cracks in the mortar, in the stillness of that bricked room. The woman, once a queen, once a child, became something else entirely. Not dead, not alive, a secret, waiting. Years passed, though no calendar marked them. Time inside the wall did not march. It curled in on itself, collapsed into hours that bled into days that bled into silence. At first, she tried to count the days. Small scratches in the stone, neat and straight, a queen's attempt to keep order. But somewhere between the 300th mark and the 1000th, the scratches lost their meaning. They crowded each other like screams in a closed room. Eventually, she stopped counting. There was still a voice inside her, small, persistent, childlike. It sang songs from a past so distant it could have been a dream. Lullabies her wet nurse used to hum. Psalms she recited at coronation rehearsals. The rhyme about the sun and the two-headed goat. Her lips remembered them long after her name began to fade. The wall was close, and the air never moved. Sometimes she would lie still and imagine wind. Just wind. She missed the way it tangled her hair when she ran down the chapel stairs. She missed hair, she missed stairs. There were days she dreamed of light so vividly that she wept upon waking, because the dream had color. Color that was the greatest cruelty. Memory had color. The real world did not. She invented a court inside her mind, recreated her coronation in perfect detail, though everyone's face was blurred. The archbishop had no eyes. Her mother's voice came from the mouth of a cat. Her dress trailed endlessly behind her, a river of silk she could not lift. These visions terrified and comforted her in equal measure. They were company, even if they were madness. She gave names to the rats. They came in and out like messengers of some other world. One she called Chancellor, another she called Moon. She spoke to them, and sometimes she sang to the stone, not out of joy, but defiance. The melodies were cracked, off-key, barely human, but they were hers. And in a place where nothing belonged to her, not her fate, not her time, not even her. Death, the sound of her own voice, was an act of rebellion. Above the world moved on. The new monarch ruled with firmness, if not grace. Ministers revised the ledgers, striking her reign from the record books. History tutors in noble houses taught that the throne had passed uninterrupted. Scholars debating the legitimacy of the royal line dared not utter her name. Her seal was destroyed. Her portraits were burned. Her name became a pause, a gap, a cough, as if she had never lived. And yet she did live. She breathed. She scratched. She dreamed, somewhere around her 5th year. Though that word meant little now, she began scratching again, not to mark days, this time to remember. In the stone behind her bed, she etched fragments, not sentences, just thoughts. The smell of jasmine. His hand was warm. The crown was too tight. Sometimes she would repeat a line, obsessively. I was the queen. I was the queen. I was the queen. Other times, she simply carved circles, over and over, until her fingers bled. Her memory became a minefield. She remembered her nurse's perfume, but forgot her own voice. She remembered the feel of velvet, but not the word for it. In dreams, she sat at court, but when she spoke, no one understood her. The bells rang, and no one turned. When she awoke, her hands were clenched, as if she had been holding something in sleep. When she opened them, there was nothing there. The hallucinations grew worse with winter. Or maybe it was summer. She no longer knew. The stone grew colder. Her skin cracked. She whispered to a figure in the dark who sometimes whispered back. Once, she heard church bells ringing and laughed with joy, but the bells never rang. There were no bells. There hadn't been bells in years. And yet she waited for a hand on the door, waited for the sound of horses, waited for someone to say it was all a mistake. But the only thing that came was silence. Silence like snow on a coffin. Silence like the forgetting of a name. And in that silence, she began to believe she had never existed, that she had been born into this room made of sorrow and echo, that perhaps there was no kingdom, no crown, no day of light, that the real world was this, stone and memory, madness and prayer, fading like dust in the cracks of a tomb no one would ever open. Her reign erased, her mind unraveling, her life unfinished. They came with tools and candles, not reverence. Decades had passed. The convent, now mostly abandoned, was being partially restored by order of a wealthy patron who fancied himself pious. The old stone walls were crumbling. The crypt had flooded twice in recent winters. The nuns were long gone. Only echoes remained. It was a mason who found the seam, a strange groove in the wall behind the chapel, too smooth, too precise. At first, he assumed it was part of the old drainage system, but when he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound came back hollow behind the wall. There was space dust. Dust choked the air as they broke through, carefully at first, then with growing urgency. What they uncovered was not a drainage channel, nor an old passageway, nor even a forgotten room. It was a sealed chamber. No door, no hinges, just bricks, silence, and stillness. And in the center of it, the remains of a woman. Her bones were collapsed gently to one side, like someone who had lain down to rest and never risen. Her arms were folded, fingers curled against her chest. The robes, though moth-tan and greyed by time, were unmistakably regal. Gold-threaded hems, a faded crest. Royal silks once dyed the color of wine. Beside her, in the dust, lay a crown, cracked, dull, but real. And on the wall behind her, scratched in uneven, weakening strokes, a single word repeated many times. Not a prayer, not a name, just Queen. The workers backed out slowly. No one spoke for a long time. It was the silence of fear, ancient, instinctive, the kind that settles over people when they realize they have stumbled into something meant never to be found. Word spread quickly. The bishop was notified, then the palace, but the church responded with a shrug so polished it was almost holy. No record of any such entombment, no mention of a royal burial on site. Perhaps she was a patron, a donor, a nun granted special status. Medieval times were imprecise, they said. The press was briefly aflame. Who was she? How did she die? Was this the lost queen, the child sovereign who vanished? And if so, who had buried her? Some called it a scandal, others called it a hoax. The royal family made no statement. The crypt was sealed again, quietly, respectfully. A plaque installed near the chapel read only, "An unknown sister, may she rest." But the workers remembered. So did a handful of historians, whose archives had long hinted at a strange disappearance, a shortened reign, a gap in the records too clean to be natural. Some pieced together the dates, the signatures, the backroom. Politics. One even found an old prayer book in the palace library, with a name scratched out so violently it tore through the page. But proof, that was harder. Time protects the guilty, and forgetfulness is easier than guilt. The truth, or some version of it, flickered like a candle in wind. Was she really the lost queen? Had she been imprisoned, murdered, martyred? The chamber offered no answers, only bones and a crown, and that word scratched in desperation by a hand that must have trembled. Queen. The body was never moved. Her name was never restored to the royal registry, but people talked, quietly, behind library walls, in university lectures, in books that vanished from stores a little too quickly. She was remembered not in titles, but in murmurs, not in portraits, but in shadows, not as a ruler, but as a warning. And sometimes, late at night, the chapel bell tolls, once, just once. Though no hand pulls the rope, the groundskeeper swears he hears breathing near the bricked wall. And in the morning light, some claim the stones bear the faint imprint of a crown. She is not truly gone, not anymore. She died in the wall, but she never left it. The stone is gone now, the crown buried or stolen, the chamber resealed. But the girl remains not in flesh, not even in name, but in the shape of the silence she left behind. And in that silence, we find the outlines of a pattern. This was not a horror born in isolation. She was not the first girl to be erased behind a veil of holiness or hidden behind a wall of ceremony. She was part of something older, colder, woven deep into the fabric of monarchy and faith, of obedience and power. How many women were buried alive in other ways? Not all were walled in stone. Some were locked in convents, some in towers, some in marriages, some in myths that told only the version of them men were willing to remember. History has a habit of losing women, sometimes by accident, more often by design. The girl in the wall was born to be queen and then declared unfit for the very power she was given. Her youth, her bloodline, her mind, all used, all judged, all discarded. Her silence was useful. Her absence convenient. It is no coincidence that when history fails to record a woman, it is usually because her survival would have been inconvenient. There were others like her, princesses who vanished from records, noble women imprisoned for rumors of prophecy or madness, heirs sent away to be nuns and never heard from again. A single accusation, hysteria, heresy, impurity could become a life sentence. The girl in the wall died without a trial, without a tomb, without a name that anyone dared say out loud. But when her bones were found, even if only for a moment, the silence cracked, and in that crack we heard the echo of countless other voices, girls who never ruled, women who were crowned but never obeyed, queens who dared to feel or think or refuse and paid for it with their lives or their legacies. She is all of them. The girl in the wall is not just a ghost story. She is a map, a warning, a question history keeps asking and never quite answering. What is the cost of power, and why does it so often begin with a girl being silenced? She scratched her memories into stone, not because she believed anyone would read them, but because writing them made her real to herself. A last act of rebellion, a final form of record-keeping when no historian would write her name. Her words were crude, misspelled, faint, but they endured, and in enduring, they became scripture, not of religion, but of resistance. Every telling of her story is an act of excavation, not just of her life, but of every woman walled in by history, every girl whose brilliance was too bright, whose bloodline was too dangerous, whose silence served someone else's power. And so we return, as we began, to the wall, not as a tomb, but as a metaphor, because the wall was never just stone. It was the system that says obedience is safer than autonomy. It was the doctrine that tells women they must disappear to be holy. It was the history that decides whose suffering deserves remembrance and whose does not. But the wall did not win. She may have died inside it, but we are outside now, and we are listening, and we are telling. And as long as the story is told, the girl in the wall never truly died. She lives in the questions she left behind. She lives in the fear her rediscovery sparked. She lives in the rage of every woman who hears her story and recognizes a version of her own in a way that her jailers could never have imagined. She escaped, not in body, but in memory, and memory is powerful. It stains, it spreads, it survives. So, let her story stand not just as a tragedy, but as a mirror for the many rooms history tried to seal, and the many voices it tried to silence. The girl in the wall never died. She just waited, and now we have heard her.